Hey, we have arrived at the second set. Thanks so much for sticking with us. Wow, what an amazing open projector and opening performance from the park staff. Really amazing. We are excited to have with us to start off our second half Jordan Magnuson. Jordan is a game designer and an author, a game poet, perhaps, author of recent book Game Poems. You should really check it out. It's an open access book, which means it's available to you, the audience member. Please, yes, you. And yeah, I'm sure you will hear much about it. Please give it up for Jordan Magnuson.
Okay, let's see. Okay, is that good? Audio good? Okay, yes. Well, first of all, I want to say WordHack is awesome. The space is awesome. Everyone I've talked to is awesome. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks, Todd, for inviting me. And so I'm here to talk about, can video games be poems? And it's not a question, by the way. That's a poem, clearly, right? So for about 15 years now, I've been making weird experimental video games. And for about 15 years, I've been trying to figure out how to explain my creative practice to other people. The games I make tend to be short and minimalistic and deeply personal explorations of the things I experience, the things I see and learn, the things that inspire me, and also the things I'm afraid of. As a couple of examples, here's a clip from Walk or Die, a subtly titled, procedurally generated game that features graphics obviously borrowed from sort of the 12-bit era. Here's a clip from Portraits of My Child, which uses extremely simple visual and auditory elements juxtaposed with text to explore metaphoric meaning and a variety of little vignettes inspired by my son's first year of life. And here's a clip from Loneliness, a short symbolic game that attempts to explore a single emotion via abstract representation, simple computation, and some basic interaction logics. So, and here's Mario 64. So the things I make tend to sit in the awkward space between conceptions of video games on the one hand, and sort of the outer edges of kind of computational poetry conceptions on the other hand. And they tend to feel a bit out of place in either sphere. I tend to think of these things as video game poems, is how I've kind of thought of them for a while. But over the years, I've struggled to find the language with which to kind of explain what I mean by that assertion, right? Like, what is a video game poem anyway? On the one hand, right, we don't really have a vocabulary for talking about video games as capable of being poetry. And on the other hand, conceptions of digital and computational poetry have generally emphasized the thread of linguistic sounds and symbols, right, as the chief thread connecting computational poetry to written and oral poetry traditions, right? The connection of poetry framed as a kind of word play or a kind of language play. And obviously, poetic language and wordplay are very significant, very rich threads extending through many, perhaps most of our poetry traditions, right? But there are other threads as well that you can, may or may not depend on words or language, right? Like poetry has a certain kind of material or political intervention. Poetry is making strange or seeing new. Poetry envisioned as a certain kind of attention to material detail, as the building of a certain kind of felt experience, a certain mode of juxtaposition, as lyric artifact, incantation, rhythm. Poetry as ritual, et cetera, right? So discussing poetry of any variety quickly presents us with, in Edward Thomas's words, dun dun dun, the thrilling question: what is poetry? And the question is, on the one hand, almost kind of a bit cliched, perhaps, but as someone interested in poetic practice, right, I found this to be kind of a constant companion. So if we look at the creative and theoretical space that exists between conceptions of digital and computational poetry on the one hand, right, and conceptions of video games on the other, we quickly see that there's no hard boundary that exists between these two categories. Right, so we have plenty of examples. Let's see, where's the mouse? There we go. Okay, so plenty of examples of things we might think of as computational poems that play with expectations and conventions established by video games. So like this is Jim Andrews' Arteroids, right, which he describes as a poetry exploder. That's certainly word-based, right, but it borrows mechanics obviously directly from the classic Asteroids computer game. Or we've got here Jason Nelson's Game, and Again Game, self-described as a digital poem, anti-design statement, and retro game. I guess we're just going to see the title screen of that one. Or Kara Stone's Just Tell Me How You Feel, write a poem that features clickable hotspots. And likewise, kind of from the other direction, right, we have plenty of examples of things we might think of as video games that play with words or language, like Silent Conversation here, which is a platform game, but where the platforms are made up of texts, or Daniel Ben-Mergui's Today I Die, which is a short sort of adventure game in which the player has to manipulate characters and objects, but also words from poems in order to make progress through various scenes, right? Or Dysphoria, which is a game centered around the juxtaposition of words with gameplay elements, right? So you've got kind of these two spheres, right? But then going a step further, you have plenty of examples of tiny video games that incorporate little or no words at all, yet which seem to have a lot in common with other artifacts we might consider to be a certain kind of poetry or computational poetry. Games like Loneliness or Passage, a short memento mori game. Omurike's Limb is a metaphoric symbolic game about sort of the pressures individuals face to conform to social norms and expectations. Or Tale of Tales, The Graveyard, which is a game about an old woman and her memories. Or here another example, Ian Bogo's A Slow Year, a game that presents sort of 4 short vignettes inspired by the seasons. So it seems strange to me, I guess I gotta watch out for that. It seems strange to me to say that video games can be poems only to the extent to which they incorporate language elements, right? Like, is a game like Dysphoria over here an example of computational poetry, while a game like A Slow Year is an example of computational non-poetry based on the presence or absence of a few lines of text? And that's a question, by the way, not a poem. So anyway, I don't think that's right. But it can be a struggle to explain, what we mean by poetry if we give up the linguistic connection, or at least I've found it to be a struggle. Critics will sometimes talk about certain video games as being poetic, and myself and other game makers have referred to our creations as game poems or poem games. But few critics or creators have sort of attempted to explain, what it means for a video game to be poetic or to be a game poem, right? And why such designations might matter, right? What difference does it make? So eventually, like Todd was saying, I decided to get my hands dirty and I wrote a book titled Game Poems to tackle these questions head on. The book is divided into 2 parts. Part 1, what is a game poem? And part 2, making game poems in practice. I don't know if you can kind of see the text up there. Okay. So, and of course, I don't have time to summarize the book in detail right here tonight. But the basis for my approach has been a broad examination of the characteristic tendencies found within lyric poetry. And I use lyric here in its broad sense to include things like, traditional poetry, modernist poetry, free verse, rap, etc. Right, and I've basically gone to poetry scholars and brought back a list of things that tend to characterize lyric poems. Things like, lyric poems tend to be short. They're subjective, they're hyperbolic, they exist in a ritual rather than a narrative space. They make use of poetic address. They juxtapose signified meaning with material meaning, and they're bound to metaphor and ambiguous imagery. And then, you can see something there. I've asked, I wasn't also, like someone else mentioned, the space here, you get a really interesting projection. I've asked, are these analogs, or are there analogs, right, to these characteristics that we can see operating within video games which aren't necessarily tied to poetic words or poetic language, right? And I found that there are really very strong analogs, and that using a list like this, it's possible to read games like Loneliness or Passage, or a slow year as examples of lyric poetry, broadly speaking, right, even though they feature no words. And not only is it possible, but it actually helps us explain why some people find these strange video games to be interesting and resonant, even though they lack anything resembling traditional fun gameplay, which for others is a huge turnoff. So as a couple of just brief examples here, if we consider poetry's interest in metaphor and ambiguous imagery, this is an intriguing consideration, I think, when it comes to video games, because it's not hard to read the history of certain types of video games as kind of infatuation with literalism, with indexical realism, the desire to achieve ever higher fidelity in physics rendering, graphics rendering, sound rendering, in order to attain a kind of hyper-realism, right, that has no use for metaphor. But video games like Portraits of My Child and Limb and Dysphoria push back against this literalist paradigm, right, by foregrounding metaphor and seeking to make the familiar unfamiliar after the fashion of poetry, you could say, and maybe helping us see the medium of video games itself in a new light. Or if we consider poetry's interest in interior reality and subjective experience, there's been pushback against these expectations when it comes to lyric poetry, right, from like experimental and avant-garde poets. But subjectivity is, again, kind of an intriguing consideration when thinking about or reading video games specifically, because video games have always been predominantly concerned with objective reality, right? That is like relating people and objects in representations of physical space. So things like spaceships flying, spaceships and various other things colliding, right? Rackets and balls colliding, people holding rackets, people holding guns, guns shooting enemies, enemies driving cars. You get the idea. Right, so against this backdrop, games like Passage or The Graveyard or Loneliness are striking for how they seek to foreground not physical objects in space, right, but the experience of a subject kind of wandering through a metaphorically projected inner landscape of experiences, beliefs, and emotions. And of course, these are just a couple of the facets that I examine in the book. But to me, the value of applying a poetry lens to video games is in kind of a systematic way, I guess, right? And identifying like a workable idea for like, what is a game poem? What might a game poem be? Is that this kind of approach sort of allows us to move past using terms like poetic as a kind of last resort to describe video games we can't seem to find words for, and allows us to move into the realm of practical observations and actual conversation that can help us see video games maybe in a new light and better appreciate certain games, and also potentially enliven creative practice, which is what the second half of my book is focused on. So here we've got a quote from Percy Shelley, who in A Defense of Poetry writes that poetry lifts the veil from the hidden beauty of the world and makes familiar objects be as if they were not familiar. So as a maker, I'd say this is a large part of what I'm interested in, which is maybe at the root of why I see my game making as a kind of poetic practice, right? I always hope that after playing one of my games, a player's experience of some aspect of the world is kind of enriched and enlivened a little bit, right? That like when people see this plain yellow screen, for instance, in the context of playing Portraits of My Child, that they can maybe come away from that and see someone's smile in a slightly new light, right? And Super Mario 64 again. I always hope also that when players come away from my games, that their experience of other video games, right, even games that aren't necessarily considered poetic or game poems, right, but that their experience of those games is, again, enriched and enlivened a little bit, because the basic building blocks of the medium have been endowed with maybe little bits of new potential, right? So that simple shapes bear more possibility, that a synthesized bleep is richer in some way, right? That a sprite's movement on screen is more charged and interesting than it was before, right? Even if just a tiny bit. This for me is really what making the games I make is all about, I would say. So I found that besides helping me to appreciate certain video games more thoroughly, Poetry Lens has also helped me to frame my own creative practice and have deeper conversations really about both video games and poetry. And so that's it. My book, like Todd said, is free and open source. I also have a few physical copies here with me. If anyone's interested, just come see me. And yeah, thank you for your time. I'd love to talk about more of this stuff over a drink later or whatever. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Jordan. I was really inspired during Jordan's presentation. It really took me back to kind of my state of mind when I first started WordHack, in that, like I mentioned at the start of the show, that I have some background in slam poetry. And there's just like not a ton of gamers hanging out in slam poetry. It was very difficult for me to connect things that I felt hit the same part of my heart that certain poems do in game. It felt like these are hitting the same thing, and I'd like to be able to like talk about them and create them as if they are hitting the same thing, rather than, oh, you do stuff with words and you do stuff with Mario jumping around and stay. And yeah, so I want to, that inspire me. I just want to share a quick thing. 1 second. Trying to duplicate. Can I duplicate? Please let me duplicate. All right, I can't duplicate. All right, I will instead drag. So this is from the introduction to my book, Hot Writing, which came out in 2016. It's a collection of interactive poems. And I was, I think, wrestling with a lot of the same ideas Jordan was talking about in relation of what makes something poetic. So I'll start off with this fake T.S. Eliot quote. I have this idea about writing where I want it to feel the same way going out as it does coming in. Like I don't know what's going to happen. Like I'm only kind of in control. Like I am hanging on the shag hairs of some mythical poem beast as it gallops. Reading a poem on a computer screen or even a book rarely feels like this to me. I want reading to feel more like playing the electric guitar. I want writing to feel more like playing the electric guitar. T.S. Eliot. Poetry is in a weird spot in the age of browsing and diminished attention spans. On the one hand, poems are short. People are reading shorter and shorter things for less time. Awesome. Should be a good time for poems. On the other hand, people are less willing to think hard about a chunk of text and are more likely to get distracted if they don't get it right away. Sounds like a bad time for poems. It is a good bad time for poems. What is poetry? The classic question. The thrilling question. We know it existed before writing and meant something different once there was a printing press, and something different once you didn't have to write in iambic pentameter, and I would hazard the assertion that poetry doesn't necessarily have anything to do with line breaks or layouts of text printed inside rectangles of various analog and light-emitting materials. But I don't really care what it is. Let's talk about what it does. How it makes language stick to your tongue like a Werther's original, how it makes you feel something, how it talks to your secret inside voice, how it excites you and makes you uncomfortable and polishes your heart until it is glossy. I just want to do what poetry does with every tool at my disposal, and I want you to let me, because sad rectangles of text on the internet bum me out, and maybe they bum you out too. I'll stop there. But that's some similar ideas. But at WordHack, we are staunch advocates of the superficial inclusion of text in a digital project. So I'm going to have to differ from Jordan on that particular point. As my grad school thesis advisor John Cayley used to say, but where is the text?